On one of my last videos on Instagram, I talked about the parts of the exposure triangle and started to talk a little bit about how they work together. In this video, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about aperture. Aperture, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important parts of the triangle. Just as a recap, aperture is the physical opening inside of the lens that lets light through to the film or the sensor. The size of that opening determines how much light actually makes it through to the film or sensor to create an exposure. Okay, so you know what an aperture is, but how do you go about selecting which aperture to use? If you remember from the last video, aperture size is described using f-stops, or less commonly, t-stops. The smaller the number, the larger the aperture. So f1.4 is much larger of an aperture than, say, f8 or f11 or f16 or f22 or 32 or 45. All right, so now you know what an aperture is, but how do you go about selecting which one to use? How big of an aperture do you want to use for your photo or video? Outside of deciding how much light reaches the sensor, probably the most important effect that aperture has on your photo is going to be in influencing how much depth of field you have. That is, how much of your photo is in focus. When it comes to apertures, the larger the opening, the shallower the depth of field. That is, the less is going to be in focus. So if you want to get that creamy background separation, you use a larger aperture. If you want more of your photo in focus, you use a smaller aperture. But come on now, you got that f1.4 lens, you want to open it wide open because that's going to give the prettiest picture, right? Well, maybe not. Even though you do get more subject separation when you shoot wide open, there are some drawbacks. Most lenses are at their sharpest when they're shot between f8 and f11, somewhere around there. When you shoot wide open, usually the lens is performing nowhere near its best. So you may sacrifice some sharpness in order to get that separation. On the other side, say you're shooting a landscape photo and you want everything in focus. So shooting at f22, 32, 45, something like that may seem like a really good idea. But after you get smaller than, say, f11, you may introduce something called diffraction. Diffraction causes your image quality to suffer and your images to lose sharpness. So moving past f11 in your aperture may actually cause your images to be worse. Another factor to consider is that sometimes, especially with environmental portraiture, you really want to see what the background is like. You don't want to blur it all out. There's no point in going to this fantastic location for a photo shoot and then shooting everything at this wide open aperture so you can't even tell what the background is. Of course, there are times when shooting wide open is the best choice. Namely, you don't have enough light, so you have to shoot wide open. Or you're in a situation where the background is very, very messy in your photo shoot and you want to hide it. Deciding how much depth you want in a photo is huge. And not only for creative reasons, it could be pragmatic as well. If you're shooting a large group or even a group of 2 or 3, you don't usually want to shoot wide open because unless your group is in an exact plane, someone is going to be a little bit ahead or a little bit behind someone else, and hence they're going to be less in focus if you start using wide open apertures. Usually for groups, I stop down to at least f5.6 or f8. The last thing that mom wants on a wedding day is to have a group photo of the family and half of them are out of focus. Here are some samples at various apertures so you can see what changing that setting does to your depth of field. Hopefully some of these tips about aperture can help you in your next photo shoot. If you have any questions, please drop a comment below. I'll be happy to help.